by FanDuel Sportsbook. I am your host, Todd Furman, joined as always by my esteemed colleague and co-host, the one, the only Payne Insider. And again, this is the perfect time to remind all of you, our loyal listeners, FanDuel.com/bettheboard. Take advantage of everything FanDuel has made available. $1,000 free bets, enhanced odds, all of the things you need to try and maximize your bankroll, and want to extend a special welcome to all our friends in the great state of Connecticut, where they'll now have legalized sports betting. Encourage you to add FanDuel to your betting arsenal. And Payne, I was going through the college football slate. I know we have a lot of ground to cover, and I was a little bit disappointed this weekend. There's no late kickoff out here on the West Coast. I'm not sure what I'm going to do with myself. No Pac-12 after dark, no Mountain West, no nothing.
I'm sure you'll figure out maybe a nice little dinner. You'll go back-to-back dinners Friday night, Saturday night. You slipped it across my desk that you'll be out of town this weekend gallivanting. I'm sure you'll manage just fine.
No, no. I will not be out of town this weekend gallivanting. The fiance will be out of town gallivanting as she's headed off to Austin for a little F1 action. I have to hold down the home front here, so it's just the pup and myself.
I got to tell you, how are you feeling about that? Sometimes those weekends away are beautiful. You just throw on the old boxer shorts and you're watching TV on the couch, just stuffing your face with Popeyes on Saturday.
It's win-win all the way around. She gets a vacation from me. I get the peace and quiet here. And, you know, the only reason, honestly, though, Payne, you deserve a ton of credit for turning her into an F1 fan, because during the pandemic, you were the one that opened up our eyes to Drive to Survive, and her and her brother have gone all in on F1 as a result of it.
It's great. And I hear they are making something similar for golf, right? The same production team is going to be following the PGA, so I'm actually looking forward to that as well. The other interesting thing here, Todd, and I don't know if this is true or not. I don't have time to go back and look. It feels like the first college football podcast in at least a long while that we haven't even talked about an SEC team.
Nope, and now all of our listeners who are tuning in are now going to turn the show off, Payne, so that's probably not the best for business. But there was a little poking and prodding that went on. We tried to figure out exactly how to build out our big game breakdown slate here. Not only do we not have any SEC football to talk about, this may be the first podcast where we've ever broken down two Mountain West games at the same time.
Yes, and that will be interesting. But the games are worthy of discussion. San Diego State Air Force, Nevada Fresno. That conference is wide open, and there's actually some good teams out there.
Yeah, a little bit of intrigue out on the West Coast, and I think that allows us the perfect segue to get into one of our two big game breakdowns before we dissect some single factors that will play a big role in terms of impacting the betting markets this weekend. And it'll take us out to Pasadena, where UCLA welcomes in the Oregon Ducks. Chip Kelly matched up against his former team. And you're looking at this number now that's kind of ping-ponged all over the place, but it's UCLA, a 2-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total on this game sits in the high 50s. Battle of game manager quarterbacks, maybe, Payne? Trying to figure out who will avoid the costly mistake between Anthony Brown for Oregon and Dorian Thompson-Robinson on the other side for UCLA. When you look at Oregon, they've looked extremely sluggish and lethargic since that big win earlier this year in Columbus against the Ohio State Buckeyes. Meanwhile, UCLA comes into the spot looking to avoid losing its third straight home game, as they've had defeats against Fresno State and Arizona in the past. The crazy part about this, though, Oregon will be getting a little bit relief as far as their offense is concerned. Joe Moorhead missed the Stanford game 2 weeks ago, called the game up in the press box last week against Cal. Mario Cristobal wasn't shy about saying they had a real difficult time adjusting personnel groupings, getting the play calls in. So you have to imagine an Oregon offense will look a little bit more dynamic on Saturday afternoon against UCLA than what we've seen the last couple weeks.
I think DTR is more than the game manager at this point, by the way. Just throwing that out there.
I'm selling the Vegas kid short, apparently, so I'm going to have all sorts of hate mail in my inbox in a couple hours from now.
I do not know what to make of Oregon's offense. It's been 6 games, and I have no clue. Loss, they play a really good Fresno team and kind of sneak by. You mentioned they shocked Ohio State on the road, and then you beat up the dregs of Stony Brook and Arizona, and then you managed to score 48 combined points against Stanford and Cal. 2 defenses outside the top 85 in efficiency. I would think most are putting an asterisk next to those last 2 because you mentioned Joe Moorhead missed the Stanford game and then called it from the box against Cal. I'm struggling, right? Like in my head, I keep coming back to not thinking any differently about Oregon's offense than I did before the season. And they're highly overrated. It's a great O-line. It is a run-based system with a QB that creates that extra man advantage in the box. You have a good play caller in Moorhead. You don't have elite backs, though. And your QB on this side of the ball, Anthony Brown, is a game manager through the air, and I think they lack some weapons, something we've talked about really during most of the Cristobal era. Now, what is interesting is I went back last night, looked at some of our preseason projections for the Ducks offense. I felt like I was wrong, and I was missing something coming into the season where everyone was kind of enamored with the Ducks, right? National championship contenders, yada, yada, yada. So there was a lot of massaging of my numbers to get Oregon's offense to a top 20 projection. I wish I would have stuck to my guns because as of today, Oregon's 43rd in offensive success rate, 34th in EPA per play, 38th in Bill Connolly's S&P+. And I know UCLA's defensive struggled a little bit when they step up in class. I just don't know if this is a step up. I really don't. And, you know, the best part of this offense for Oregon is their offensive line, as I mentioned. They're damn good, 10th in line yards. It looks like they're going to get some guys back as well. Alex Forsythe is going to return. I think he beefs up that unit a little bit. Travis Dye is obviously really dynamic and explosive. Brown can kind of catch you off guard at times on some keepers. Overall, the Ducks are 13th in EPA per rush. But I do wonder if some of that down-to-down success is not there with Verdell out in a game like this. And if you look at some of the down-to-down rushing stuff, Oregon's 34th in success rate. And I know Mario Cristobal in his presser kind of spotted that and mentioned it. And he said something to the effect of, expect Trey Benson to be in the rotation this week. And I think he's probably more of like the down-to-down power back than Dye is. You do have a UCLA defense that's fringe top 20 in line yards. They also see a mobile quarterback every day at practice. But if Oregon can run, I think everything about this game changes. If not, then as you kind of hinted at, Anthony Brown's forced to be more efficient through the air. I thought he did a good job at Ohio State doing enough early on where Ohio State couldn't really load the box, but then there were some changes made defensively, and Ohio State made some adjustments, and Anthony Brown was 3 for his last 12, and that's kind of when Ohio State got back in the game. But if Anthony Brown can hit a few passes, maybe that opens some things up. Maybe that helps the ground game have more space to operate. UCLA has been vulnerable through the air. That's kind of their Achilles heel, and they play 5 guys. They play 5 defensive backs, right? And yet they're 88th in passing success rate, 101st in EPA per pass allowed. I just don't know if Anthony Brown's going to be that guy. And he's just a below-average thrower. The one area where he is actually somewhat decent is in that one-read intermediate pass range, off play action, or the RPO concept. That's basically his strength as a passer, that 10 to 19 yard window off play action. The other thing, I think, as you mentioned, Joe Moorhead's return and just kind of reading between the lines, Todd, and something we kind of talked about last night off air. Do we think some of the tempo potentially returns for the Ducks offense? And that's something we really haven't seen the last 2 weeks.
Yeah, I think it has to be a big part of it because when you watch Oregon in the game against Stanford, we can say what we want about the end-of-game situation. That's neither here nor there with the personal fouls and everything that gave the Cardinal a chance to win. The best adjective I could use to describe watching them, and I watched that game in its entirety last Friday against Cal, they were disjointed. I mean, there was never consistency there in terms of when things were going well that they could start playing downhill. You could see the frustration on Anthony Brown's face waiting for the calls to come in from the sidelines. And even Mario is a guy who, as you've talked about at great lengths, wants to impose his will physically. There were chances where Cal's defense was reeling and it would still take them 25 to 30 seconds. It would allow Cal to substitute. And it just didn't feel like that same Oregon offense when things are clicking, as we've seen against Ohio State earlier this year. Joe Moore had a previous stops where it's getting those snaps in, it's getting a defense on roller skates and being able to take advantage that you can hit with quick ruthlessness and everything else to try and really be able to make things go a lot more efficiently. So we didn't see that. I have to imagine just by default that they'll be better in that department if they're able to string together a couple first downs.
Absolutely. And I think the other element of this game is, you hate to be the guy, but if, talking third downs, but if Oregon's ground game isn't rolling early, it'll be interesting to see that matchup on third down. UCLA has struggled defensively to get off the field. They are outside the top 80 in third and fourth down success rate. So something to monitor there. If Oregon's struggling on early downs to pick up some yards, then UCLA probably is able to get off the field a little bit more. If there are those short yardage situations and you have a quarterback like Anthony Brown that's multiple and you can't really, you have to defend both the run and pass in the third and medium, third and short areas, that'll probably be an area where they're able to dominate UCLA and stay on the field for some long sustained drives. But ultimately, I just come back to not really knowing what Oregon is. I look at our power number, and it certainly shows value on Oregon here. And then I dig into some of the numbers, and I'm just like, my gut is saying they're simply not as good as our power rating. And so that's kind of left me on the sidelines here.
It makes a ton of sense when you try and figure out what the Ducks are. We'll see if they can look a lot more like the team we thought was going to have an inside track to the college football playoff, or a team that's really struggled to put up crooked numbers each of the last couple weeks. Meanwhile, on the other side, when you look at this UCLA offense, the key to their success this season has been the ground game. 200-plus yards rushing in each of the last 4 games. They went for more than 300 in Tucson against Arizona, 237 last week in Seattle. Both resulted in wins and covers. We've seen the Michigan transfer Zach Charbonnet along with Britton Brown provide a very formidable 1-2 punch as the tandem is combined for more than 1,000 yards and 6 yards per carry with 11 touchdowns so far to date. Success rate, as far as the ground game is concerned, well above the national average, 41 runs of 12-plus yards, and it obviously takes some of the pressure off of DTR, who I'll make the case last week when I watched him against Washington, looked like he was comfortable and in full command of what they wanted to do. 87 yards rushing on 12 carries, 21 of 26 throwing the ball, and keep in mind that all came without one of his top receivers in Kyle Phillips, who was a DMP, but should be back and very much in the thick of things for Saturday's game against the Ducks.
And we heard Chip Kelly really praise DTR, and he kind of hinted that him being close to 100% now is what we are looking at health-wise. I know that was a question mark we had towards the end of the Stanford game, but Chip Kelly said, hey, DTR's feeling a little bit better right now. I think this is kind of appointment television, right? Chip Kelly against his old team. I don't think UCLA veers too far from what's made them really successful, and that's the ground game you mentioned. But I would expect a gadget play or two, something that hasn't been seen on film yet. UCLA does have an offensive edge here on paper. And to me, and this is, again, the struggle I have with Oregon, is they have a couple outstanding players, but there's some holes. And the high-end players like Thibodeau, and you also have some solid coverage guys like Williams and McKinley and Wright, they kind of give Oregon a perception defensively that probably isn't close to the reality of the unit in its entirety. And that's what continues, again, to give me some struggles. But in totality, you're like looking at a Ducks defense that's 106th in passing success rate, 65th in EPA per pass allowed as well. And so I think DTR might have some success through the air a little bit here. I know he's not an overly dynamic passer, but I think he's improved enough. The accuracy has been better. His decision-making's been better. When the O-line has kept him clean, 122 passer rating. When Chip allows him to throw with play action, that is when DTR's been his best, 131 passer rating there. So I've seen some strides made in at least some of the metrics. I've only watched a handful of UCLA football games. I'm sure you've seen more. The other head-scratching part of Oregon's defense, for possibly having the number 1 pick in the draft at the end, Oregon's front seven creates virtually no havoc. And they're not stout against the run either, which they need to be in a game like this. 84th in line yards, 72nd in stuff rate, 60th in success rate rushing. And I think that's probably where this gets interesting. You have a UCLA team that just kind of lives and dies with the ground game, especially on early downs. They have the highest run rate on early downs. And even though the entire world knows UCLA wants to run, they can still run. And it's because of that Bruins O-line, extremely physical. 6th in line yards created. Only 10% of UCLA's runs have been stuffed. And it allows UCLA to stay ahead of the down and distance. And so you look at some of the early down rushing metrics, 7th in EPA per rush in early downs, 22nd overall. Now, you get Mace Funa back for the Ducks front 7. I think that's huge. But we're going to need to see a level of physicality from Oregon's defensive front that we really haven't seen this year. And I think that will really determine some of this game. You did mention Kyle Phillips. It does look like he will be back. Practice Tuesday, ran all of the receiver drills. Not only is he UCLA's best receiver, but if you look at where he runs his routes, 92% of them from the slot. Oregon's 3 defenders with the most slot coverage snaps in Hill, Stevens, and McKinley, they've given up a combined 121 passer rating when defending the slot. So let's monitor that status of Kyle Phillips. Again, it looks really positive, but I think he has the ability to be a real factor here on offense, especially in that slot.
Pac-12 race continues to tighten up as you look at the South. Utah very much in the thick of things. A loss for UCLA would put them a little bit behind the 8 ball, and suddenly the North appears to be a 2-horse race with both teams residing in the state of Oregon, given some of the uncertainty and turmoil going on with Washington State right now. Lord only knows who will come out and be playing in Las Vegas that first Friday in December, vying for conference bragging rights, since I don't think any teams in this league, despite the national narrative talking about Oregon winning out, having a chance to get into the college football playoff, is at all relevant for a national championship, but that's a different discussion for a completely different day. From the West Coast, Payne will go to the Midwest.
I don't want to cut you off or put you on the spot.
No problem.
If Oregon and Ohio State were to play right now, based on how those teams are trending, I think that's a wildly different game.
Oh, 100%. 100%. And I mean, I had to look at some of my numbers, and I don't have them in front of me. I mean, even if the game was played at Outson, I might be close to making Ohio State a touchdown favorite in this particular spot. And when you look at this Oregon offense, so much of the success they had was throwing over the top, hitting some of those deep balls. I think Ohio State might score nearly every time they got the football if they were able to block Kayvon Thibodeau coming off the edge.
Yeah, I'm looking right now at our numbers. We'd make Ohio State -11 on a neutral right now.
So, it tells you all you need to know. And the unfortunate part, honestly, that, Ohio State fans and the reality they'll need to deal with, that if Oregon were to run the table and finish out the regular season at, what would that make them? 12-1 as conference champions with their 1 loss against Stanford, and Ohio State were to do the same as a 1-loss Big Ten champion, Oregon has to get in by virtue of the head-to-head victory over Ohio State. Now, power numbers don't support it. The eye test won't support it. But I have to at least hold these teams accountable for the games they play. Do I think that's the scenario we see? No, not at all. But if that is the case and those two teams are fighting for a playoff spot, I think 1-loss Oregon gets in over 1-loss Ohio State.
Yeah, I would agree there just because you have the head-to-head, and I think that's probably the general thought process for a lot of the folks on that committee, is not necessarily digging into some of the metrics, not necessarily digging into the current trajectory and trend lines of those teams, but you have the easy data point, and it's very difficult to get over the fact that, hey, Oregon went into Ohio State and beat them outright.
Exactly. I think if it was a 3-point game and it was played up in Eugene and Ohio State lost, then you could come with a little bit of a different angle. Whereas Oregon going into your backyard winning a game outright is a 2-touchdown favorite. Tough to try and discount that regardless of where those teams are at the end of the year, because even for us who live in a world of power numbers, projections, and what a team will be going forward, not what they've accomplished so far, I can't completely ignore some of the existing data points that are out there. From the West Coast, though, we'll go to the Midwest for a little Big 12 showdown at 3:30 Eastern Time in Ames, Iowa, Jack Trice Stadium, where it's the Iowa State Cyclones welcoming in Oklahoma State. You're looking at Iowa State, a touchdown favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. This total sits at 47, and the Cowboys have won each of the last 2 matchups. Oklahoma State, though, this season has been relatively fortunate. They were able to erase a 27 20-7 deficit at Boise State a few weeks ago and pitch a shutout in the second half. Even last week against Texas, Oklahoma State trails 17-3. Texas going in for the knockout blow. It's a pick six that changes the game from what could have been 24-3 to 17-10. And to Oklahoma State's credit, they used that as a rallying cry off of their bye and were able to win that game outright. What's crazy when you look at what Mike Gundy has been able to accomplish despite all of his naysayers since taking over in Stillwater back in 2005, Oklahoma State has won 16 games in which they trail by 12 points or more. When you look at Oklahoma State, they're 17-8 in their last 25 games against the AP top 25. And what's even crazier than that, only Nick Saban and Dabo Swinney have more ranked wins at their respective programs than what Mike Gundy has been able to accomplish, as he's beaten ranked opponents in 3 straight games, 8 straight wins for a program. I give you all of that information to try and give you this, that this number speaks volumes about what Iowa State is this season, what they were expected to be, and the fact in their 2 losses against both Iowa and Baylor, when you dig into some of the numbers, they were the dominant football team, at least from what you saw on the statistical side. Now, all those things being equal, you do have to go out there, win. You have to cover and win this game going away by more than a touchdown. Do you trust Brock Purdy, Payne, to give Iowa State enough of a balanced attack that the run and the throw will be ways that they can attack Jim Knowles' defense in space?
That's the ultimate question. And last week we talked about Oklahoma State's defense not being as good as some of the metrics indicated. And I would say even after clamping Texas down the final 25 minutes or so, where the Longhorns basically went into a shell, that's still true. You know, Texas went up and down the field early, and you pointed that out perfectly. They had a chance to go up 24-3, game over, end it. Not a chance Spencer Sanders and that offense come back from a 21-point deficit. But Casey Thompson throws an 85-yard pick six 5 minutes before half, and the game just flipped on its head. But I do want to see Brock Purdy and Iowa State step up in a big game offensively for once, right? There's a clear correlation to their offensive production compared to the strength of their defensive opponent. And I think it's partly because the offense is vanilla. And you start to kind of pick and pull what the offensive production looks like against the better teams on the schedule, and it's pretty bleak. You know, the third-ranked FCS defense in Northern Iowa holds the Cyclones to 16 and a 39% success rate. First 3 quarters against Iowa, well below that 40% success rate mark as well. Now, I know Iowa's offense was really bad, so it looks like Iowa State dominated, but I'm just speaking specifically to the offensive production. And then all of a sudden, I believe Purdy got yanked from that game late because some of the mistakes he was making. Against Baylor, probably a game they should have won, but when you look offensively, less than a 40% success rate the first 3 quarters as well in that game. So the 3 best defenses they've played, the offense has really struggled. The hope is obviously that Breece Hall is able to break an explosive run or two and flip this game and change it. And as deep and as good as Oklahoma State's defensive line has been, they're still outside the top 40 in both rushing success rate and EPA per rush allowed. And so you can see a situation where, you know, Breece Hall finds some room here. I think we need to see an uptick from the Cyclones' offensive line. They need to play better. And that's been one of the disappointing areas. They had 7 guys returning with starting experience. I can't remember which preseason publication it was, but there was one that ranked Iowa State's offensive line as a top 5 unit in the entire country. And that just has not been the case. You look at some of these numbers, 71st in both line yards and opportunity rate for that Cyclones O-line, 85th in stuff rate allowed. I know Brock Purdy does have a tendency to hold on to the ball a little bit and not get it out quickly, but he's been pressured on 34% of his dropbacks. PFF has the Cyclones O-line graded outside the top 60 in pass blocking. So that needs to be better here. And there's some little underlying things offensively that just hasn't gone the way we anticipated them going. At the same time, I think we need to see Brock Purdy just be a difference maker. He needs to be efficient. And again, he just has really struggled in some of these games that are a little bit larger against better competition. There's been this real lack of inconsistency where he'll go, 2-3 drives and look fantastic, and then it's like head-scratching mistake. And it was interesting listening to his presser. I don't know if you heard that or not, but he basically outlined why Oklahoma State specifically given their offense trouble. And he flat out said, they match up well with us. The front seven does a good job, and their safeties have been great defending our tight ends. So I think that is a matchup to watch. You have tight ends Charlie Kohler and Chase Allen. They are healthy, 100% healthy for the first time in a long time against the poke safeties and Peel and Taylor. Through 6 games, that safety duo of Peel and Taylor for Oklahoma State, they've given up a 65 passer rating combined when targeted, 3 picks, no touchdowns. We know Iowa State isn't the most dynamic with their receivers outside. That's probably as nice as I can put it, Todd. So I think when you're looking at this matchup for Purdy to have great success throwing the ball, it's going to, come off play action, but it needs to be Kohler and Allen kind of dominating that matchup against Oklahoma State safeties.
They're going to have to figure out something creative to try and get this team going. Provide that spark like you highlighted there. When you look at the way the past 2 meetings have gone, Breece Hall has been relatively effective. I mean, last year in the loss, 20 carries, 185 yards, and a touchdown. The year before, 18 for 76 and 2 touchdowns. What's interesting about that meeting back in 2019 against Oklahoma State, that was Breece Hall's career high for receptions in a game. He had caught 6 balls for 42 yards. So maybe it's using him more as a threat coming out of the backfield. I mean, Purdy was ultra efficient last weekend against Kansas State. Wasn't required to do a whole heck of a lot, but 22 of 25 for 208 yards, 9 different receivers caught the ball, and Purdy was 9 of 9 on third downs for 70-plus yards. But as you've talked about at great lengths, the best way to avoid those third down conversions, convert on first and second down, and it takes a lot of pressure off a team. And as far as the offensive line, Iowa State has raved about Jared Huffner, who they've inserted into the offensive line group. We'll see if that pays dividends, taking over for a 6-year senior in Sean Foster. But there is no doubt you're exactly right, saying that this group has not lived up to some of those preseason expectations as the road graders that you'd want for Brock Purdy, who in his own right has not realized his full potential for a guy a lot of people talked about as a potential first-round pick a few years ago. When you look at the other side of the ball, Oklahoma State, middle of the pack as terms of yards per play efficiency. They appear to be just about average in a lot of some of the key metrics there. There's no doubt that they've started to find and identify at least a bell cow back in the form of Jaylen Warren, 33 carries for 193 yards last week, and he did most of his damage in the fourth quarter against Texas. 14 of those carries for 138 yards. It was his 4th straight 100-yard rushing performance, and he's carried the ball 27 times or more in the last 4 contests. Tay Martin, we've seen what he means to the passing game when he's out there healthy, giving Spencer Saunders a true number 1. But the reality of it is when you dig into Oklahoma State and you look at Spencer Saunders, just once this season he's completed more than 60% of his passes, has a grand total of 32 completions in his last 2 games with a 2 to 4 touchdown to interception ratio and a QBR of less than 60 in 4 of his 5 starts. Payne, does Oklahoma State have the playmakers to hit big plays against Iowa State's defense, or do they have to be more methodical, dinking and dunking their way down the field, knowing that Iowa State has been one of the best defenses in the country when it comes to preventing the big play?
I think Gundy and the offense would take whatever they can possibly get here. I am looking at this game, and last week was supposed to be the week that the offense got on track. You think about coming off of the bye, and you mentioned them finding an identity with their ground game, and they were getting healthier, and we expected to see a wrinkle or two. And Oklahoma State was facing a defense in its weight class against Texas. Everything pointed upwards. And then we watch it unfold, and boy, not good. Oklahoma State's offense scored 9 points the first 3 quarters against a Texas defense that we have outside the top 80 in EPA per play allowed. 6 of those 9 points Oklahoma State scored were aided by drive-extending personal fouls by Texas. Oklahoma State opened that game with a 38% success rate in the first quarter, which is a script Mike Gundy and his staff devised for 2 weeks. And then in the second quarter, 25% overall success rate. And then the adjustments out of the half led the Pokes to a 20% success rate in the third quarter. And, we talk all the time about the scoreboard not being quite indicative of what truly transpires. And I think that was the case last week. Oklahoma State's post-game win expectancy, 24% against Texas. And the guy we outlined in Jaylen Warren I think he came on strong in the second half. Maybe there was some wear down factor for Texas off of the Oklahoma game. And again, Oklahoma State was pretty refreshed off their bye. He appeared rested, almost 7.5 yards a carry, total EPA of 3.1 in the second half. So he did kind of help that Pokes offense find some of its identity and success in that second half. But I'm not sure they'll be able to run on Iowa State. On paper, that feels like a matchup that is pretty tough sledding. Oklahoma State's offensive line, 115th in line yards. 22% of their runs have been stuffed at or behind the line of scrimmage, which is staggering when you have a power back like Warren and a quarterback that contributes in the ground game with designed runs. Iowa State also on the defensive line, not as stout as we probably projected coming into the season, but they are still top 35 in defensive line yards, EPA per rush, and rushing success rate allowed. You're going to have a defensive coordinator that likes to throw some curveballs and disguise things in John Heacock. I think he is going to make Spencer Sanders beat him. And last year they loaded the box to stop Chuba Hubbard, and I thought they did a pretty good job aside from a run or two. I believe there was that 32-yard touchdown where Hubbard was just better than everybody, made a ridiculous cut and broke a couple tackles and leaked out the backside. But aside from that run, I thought Iowa State did a pretty good job. Spencer Sanders was decent in last year's game. He went 20 for 29. He had the two big mistakes, but he was competent enough through the air where, you were able to give Hubbard some room. I think when I look at Iowa State's defense, you kind of mentioned them maybe being susceptible to the big play. I think they've done a decent job limiting the explosives, but where they've been a little bit down is they're 68th in passing success rate. So they've given up some of the short and intermediate throws. And again, Sanders isn't great, but I think the best version of him is on intermediate throws. He's got a 112 passer rating. Adjusted accuracy on those intermediate throws, 78%. So you get him on rollouts, you get him off the play action, and you have him throw in that intermediate area. That's maybe where he can find some of his success through the air. I just don't see a path here where Oklahoma State's doing a ton offensively. And I just kind of think the key for the Cyclones defense is not just, it feels like they need to be dominant here, right? This is a matchup. If you're for real, this is an offense you should dominate. And it's not just about getting stops, right? It's not about, getting Oklahoma State off the field. How about some 3-and-outs, right? How about creating some turnovers? Because I think that'll play a role here. And for whatever reason, and you probably know better than I do here, obviously Oklahoma State special teams have been pretty decent. Iowa State's just kind of middling. But Iowa State's offense right now is not starting in great field position, outside the top 100 in starting field position. In a game like this, it would be massive if the defense can actually give the ball back to, Breece and Purdy in decent positions to where they don't have to go 74, 75 yards methodically every single time. And so that's what I'm looking for from Iowa State's defense, is actually be dominant, right? It's one thing to get a stop. It's another thing to put your offense in a position to score. And I think when you look at a game like this with a total at 47 and how the styles are played, you would expect a grinder. So getting some good field position for your offense, I think, goes a long way here if you're the Cyclones.
Hey, you have to try and keep that fan base involved and engaged right from the opening kickoff. I mean, you look at what Iowa State did defensively in their other big home game this year. I mean, they held Iowa to less than 200 yards of offense and still lost the game by double digits. So you can't beat elite level opponents if you're not strong in all three phases of the game. You get that big momentum play or two and force Oklahoma State out of its comfort zone. They were pretty fortunate, as we talked about, to get back in the game against Texas. It's a defense more than capable of making a big play. So you have to kill the giant when they're down if Iowa State wants to stay in the conference race at this point, already being saddled with one loss against the Baylor Bears. Two big games broken down as eloquently as we know how to do around these parts. I encourage you to follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You, of course, can follow me there as well. Most importantly, follow the podcast at Bet the Board Pod and go to youtube.com, search Bet the Board. You can subscribe to our Bet the Board pregame show, which drops every Friday afternoon at noon Eastern. A little bit more of a short form content platform where we bring on some of the leaders in the industry to talk about relevant topics and such. Brad Powers will be the guy that you want to identify in the middle of the show as well, for a guy that'll share his updates on college football power ratings in terms of teams going up and teams going down. The reason I say teams going down, Payne, is because we'll have a team that's probably down more than any in college football since the start of the season, going on the road Saturday afternoon in the Clemson Tigers to take on the Pittsburgh Panthers. And you look at FanDuel Sportsbook, Pittsburgh in this game, we'll call them roughly a field goal favorite. Total's been bet up a touch to 48. Clemson was a team listed as a 17.5-point favorite before the season on Game of the Year numbers. They remain winless against the spread so far this campaign, 0-6 where it matters most. 2 losses have come against bona fide top 20 teams, the season opener against Georgia, and an overtime loss in Raleigh against NC State. Clemson has dominated Pittsburgh, winning the last 2 meetings by an average of 30-plus points per game. Clemson does enter this coming off of its first game as an unranked program since 2014. They've played a bevy of close games. 4 straight have all been decided by 1 possession. And then when you look at Clemson, this offense has been nowhere to be found. They haven't scored more than 21 points against an FBS opponent all season long. When you begin to break this game down, Payne, numbers aside, how do you feel things will play out, and what's the most important matchup you're looking for if Clemson's going to have some success and upset Pittsburgh on Saturday?
I think the sexy side of the matchup is obviously Kenny Pickett and a calm fringe top 10 Pittsburgh offense going against a Clemson defense that's still top 5. I think that's what everyone wants to see, good on good. Partly the reason Kenny Pickett came back to school was to prove himself in games like this. And he's struggled when competition increased the last few years, but he's been obviously lights out this year. But if you go back to some of the matchups that Pickett's had against Clemson, it's been pretty ugly. In 2018, 4 for 16 with a negative 0.45 EPA per pass against Clemson. And then last year, threw 4 interceptions against this Tigers defense. So it's been struggle city for Pickett at times against Clemson, the 2 times he's faced him. I do think it'll be a little bit different here. Pickett's playing, obviously, the best he ever has. Every part of his game looks improved. He's gone pretty much nuclear anytime the O-line keeps him clean. He's shredded teams when they've tried to blitz, and it looks like he's pushing the ball downfield a little bit better. He actually, when you look at some of the metrics, he is better the further he pushes the ball downfield. So there's really no luck in some of his numbers. He's also not putting the ball in harm's way. Just 1.6% of his passes have been turnover worthy. I'm really intrigued to see the cat and mouse between him and Venables. Like, what is Venables coming up with here? Does he blitz Pickett and force him to get rid of it a little bit quicker than normal? If you look through 7 weeks, Pickett's been blitzed on 37% of his dropbacks. He's got a 133 passer rating, 11 touchdowns, no picks when blitzed. We have a Pittsburgh offensive line that returned 7 guys with starting experience, and they have been outstanding. Only a 27% pressure rate allowed, and they're inside the top 30 in both standard down and passing down sack rate allowed. So to me, Pitt's O-line has been elite, and I think when I put him in that elite category, it's because the most impressive part with how they've pass blocked so far is that Kenny Pickett's allowing his receivers time to get open. He is going through all of his progressions. Pickett's held on to the ball nearly 3.3 seconds before release. That's the most in all of college football among quarterbacks with at least 120 pass attempts. So Pickett basically holds on to the ball forever, which really indicates the O-line's been dominant to me. And he forces your corners to hold up in coverage longer than normal. And I think Pickett buying his receivers time to get open could be important against a Clemson defense that right now 8th in yards per coverage snap allowed, 13th in EPA per pass allowed. Is Venables going to try to force a quicker release from Kenny Pickett? And will the pressure even get home when he does attempt to blitz? And then you have another element offensively here where you're like, some things just got to give. And it's when Pittsburgh gets inside the Clemson 40. Who's going to win that battle? Because Pickett's been great, and that's led Pittsburgh right now to 5.6 points per trip inside their opponent's 40. Clemson's defense, they've been Fort Knox, right? They kind of hunker down a little bit. They've only surrendered 1.6 points per trip inside their 40. So, that will be something interesting to look at. Clemson's got to muddy this game up, it feels like. And we've, talk all the time about styles making fights. Clemson's only shown an ability to win low-scoring games, Todd, as you kind of mentioned there. So unless something changes for Clemson's offense where suddenly their O-line can protect and DJ gets his confidence back and the yips are gone and he can hit a few explosives because Pittsburgh's playing too aggressively on defense, which they do at times, the key basically becomes Clemson's defense turning this into a rock fight and preventing Kenny Pickett from just going bonkers. I think that's really the only way Clemson's offense might be able to hang in this game, Todd.
Big question I have here, and we talk all the time about strength of schedule, and as you start to get more data points, it becomes less and less relevant because you have conference opponents there. I looked through Pitt's schedule, and it's far from a murderer's row. UMass, at Tennessee, Western Michigan, UNH, at Georgia Tech, at Virginia Tech, and I think we can kind of pick apart some of those opponents there, but the one common denominator in this, and this is why, Payne, I thought I wanted to try and make a case for Clemson. I'll be completely honest. I went, all right, we were trying to figure out what this number was going to be. Clemson struggles on Friday night. Pitt takes care of business in win-aided Lane Stadium on Saturday. And then you look at the one common opponent. Clemson in a game against Georgia Tech mustered a grand total of 14 points. Now, that was a game that was interrupted with weather. It was never really in sync by any stretch of the imagination. And this is a Pitt team who goes on the road against that same Georgia Tech defense and scores 52 points in the process. I'm going to be fascinated to see, like you said, if Clemson turns this thing into a track meet. I don't think they have the firepower, but if this game is played in the low 20s, you have to lean towards the Clemson side. But I think when you look at the betting market, it's so fascinating because you and I have both said, how far are we supposed to adjust Clemson before there's finally going to be value in a team that everyone, had projected in the top 3 coming into the season. But at the same time, this game being bet over, at least initially, suggests that there may be a few more points on the board, which probably isn't a harbinger of success if you want to make a case for the Clemson side.
This is a really interesting game. And, I try and talk to guys that I truly respect throughout the course of the week. And there's an information exchange throughout the course of the year, right? Like some guys deal in college football, some guys deal in the NBA, some guys deal in baseball. And, you find guys that you trust over the years. And everyone had a real difference of opinion on this game. And that's the most interesting part. And it's pretty clear why that's happening. And you did see Pittsburgh get to 4.5 some places. And we're back down to 3 as we record this podcast early Wednesday morning. This is one of the toughest games because if we look at our season-long numbers, which include some of last year still, there's value on Clemson. If I look at my weighted power numbers that only factor in the last 4 games, Pittsburgh should be about a 4-point favorite. And that probably triggers a bet, obviously, at -3. Typically, I will stay off games like that unless there is a piece of information or there's a glaring matchup advantage somewhere where, those two numbers are like drastically different. Yesterday morning, as you alluded to, we saw this over come in from 46.5 or even out to 48.5 some places. And 48 is a key. So I think that move is extremely real to the over. And at this point, you've lost about 5% of your edge in that 2-point adjustment upwards. I will say this. It looks like DJ, relatively speaking, played the best game of the season that he's had last week against a pretty good Syracuse defense. He was able to hit some explosives down the field. I believe he connected on 3 big-time throws. The ground game was able to get going just a little bit. You're right. Like, this is a style-type game. Clemson, if they're going to cover this number, needs this to be played in the low 20s. But if this is a game where they are allowing, 28 points, 30 points, we're going to have to see an offensive performance that we haven't seen from Clemson in the past. And there is an ability here to hit some explosives on Pittsburgh because they play so aggressively, and maybe that game plan will change defensively for Pittsburgh, right? Maybe they come out and say, hey, we're going to make these guys methodically try to move the ball, which they haven't been able to do. We don't want to give them a luck play over the top here or there that builds confidence. So this is a really intriguing game. I'm looking forward to watching it. You will obviously have two very different perspectives on handicapping this game, and it'll come down to simply, what do you value most? Are you someone that still has last year's data incorporated to some extent into your power number? If that's the side, you're probably taking a value bet in Clemson and seeing what happens. If you're someone that's only focused on this season and waiting out things over the last 3 or 4 games, you're probably going to find some value in Pittsburgh, and ultimately we'll see which side is correct.
Yeah, I mean, one last thing on Clemson, when you look at some of their offensive numbers, I mean, they're hard to even stomach and fathom. 113th in scoring offense, 84th in rushing offense, 107th in passing offense, 115th in total offense, and maybe the most important metric, or some of them in addition to success rates, 115th in yards per play, churning out less than 5 yards a pop. DJ's numbers so far this year, he's 55% completion percentage, 97 of 174, 4 touchdowns to 3 picks. Last year, in just 2 starts against Notre Dame and Boston College, nearly matched that same yardage production, 4 touchdowns, no picks. Let's see what we get from the Clemson Tigers this week.
It's not shocking either, right? Like, actually think about this in its simplest form. The offensive line for Clemson's regressed each of the last couple seasons. Your running backs are what, right? Like, your most talented guy, the guy you were trying to give the bulk of the carries to, was Shipley, and he goes down with an injury. Who is the difference maker outside? And now all of a sudden you have DJ lose his confidence, and there was accuracy questions coming into the season. So it's not stunning. Obviously it is when you look at like the ratings and the star ratings, but again, it's like the offensive line stinks. There aren't great running backs. Who's the dynamic receiver? And then at the same time, you had the most important position show signs of real regression.
Yep. Oh, it's been a big problem. I mean, this offensive line that wasn't that good in the past, I mean, at least towards the latter portion of last year and early this year, has had 3 different combinations of centers out there in some capacity. You talk about difference makers, Lynn J. Dixon transferring out with along with a variety of other players. It's been a trying season for the Clemson Tigers. We'll see if they can get things figured out, at least for a 1-game sample size against Pittsburgh. A pair of teams, Payne, that are already bowl eligible with 6 wins to their resume will do battle in Colorado Springs on Saturday night for Mountain West bragging rights here. It's the Air Force Falcons, a 3.5-point favorite as they'll welcome in the Aztecs of San Diego State. Total in this game sits at 40 at FanDuel Sportsbook. The Aztecs have won the last 8 meetings versus the Air Force Academy, although the last 3 were decided by 4 points or fewer. This will be the first time since Air Force will be favored against San Diego State since 2011. Back then, Air Force lost outright as a 7-point favorite. Troy Calhoun, of course, the common denominator, was the head coach still. Back then is now Brady Hoke. I'm not sure if he had been fired by Michigan or if he was still at Ball State. My timeline is a little bit blurry in that regard. Air Force, to their credit, has been great with their opening script. They've scored a touchdown in their opening drive for the 5th time in as many weeks in their upset of Boise State last weekend. But the Broncos held them in check for large stretches, just 304 rushing yards for the Falcons on 66 carries. When I look at this game, Payne, we know San Diego State isn't going to blow you away with anything they do offensively. There's no Marshall Faulk anywhere on that roster, or even a Ryan Lindley under center. Can San Diego State do enough running the football against an undersized Air Force defensive front to keep this game competitive and maybe win this thing outright?
There's no Donnell Pumphrey either. How could you forget about him?
He was a hell of a playmaker there. Rashad Penny, too. He was a San Diego State guy, right?
First round pick.
Well, I mean, I wasn't going to try and throw the baby out with the bathwater there. He shouldn't have been a first-round pick, but I couldn't remember if he was an SDSU guy, but I thought so.
This is my kind of football right here. Total at 40, where every first down and possession actually means something. Although this probably is a little slow for me even, right? I mean, you have Air Force and San Diego State. They are both among the top 7 run-heaviest teams. Both play like snails, 115th or slower in snaps per minute. But ultimately, I think this game comes down to 2 things for me, Todd. One on the matchup side, one on the price side. On the matchup side, both teams want to run the ball, obviously, right? And sure, in a game with a total at 40, you could have the unexpected explosive pass or two that can completely change the dynamic of this entire game. But I think the focus should be on some of the down-to-down things where you kind of incorporate what these teams do most. And on paper, I want to see if Air Force can stop San Diego State's ground game. Air Force right now 90th in EPA per rush allowed. They've given up some explosive runs. And I think in this matchup, it's important to dig into some of like the finer details of the ground game here, because you have a team in San Diego State that runs on more than 65% of their snaps. And if you look at standard downs, Air Force is 74th in line yards allowed. So when the down and distance doesn't spell out run or pass, and the opponent can do both, Air Force has been bullied in the trenches a little bit. Air Force has only stuffed 15% of runs at or behind the line of scrimmage. It tells me there's going to be some situations where San Diego State is looking at 3rd and 3, 3rd and 2, 3rd and 1, right? 4th and 2 or 4th and 1 a few times in this game because Air Force isn't creating enough negative plays or getting run stops. And when Air Force has been put in those positions defensively trying to defend 2 yards or less on 3rd and 4th down, they're 116th in the country. San Diego.
That's not very good for those scoring at home. There's only, 130 teams in the FBS?
Yes. And you look at San Diego State's offense in that power success rate category, they're 10th in the country. So the Aztecs have been great picking up that short yardage on 3rd and 4th down to move the chains. And I think ultimately in a game like this, you will see teams say, hey, we're at midfield. Hey, we're at the opponent 45 and it's 4th and 1. It's 3rd and 2. Like, you're going to be able to have some success there, I think, if you're San Diego State. Then the biggest factor is price. And obviously, information and matchups matter, but this is obviously a market. And if this game were played last week on a neutral, we'd make San Diego State -2.5, -20. So like 2.8. And we bumped Air Force up 1.5 points for the outright win at Boise. We kept San Diego State the same after beating San Jose State. You factor in Air Force's home field advantage. We call that pretty minimal. We make Air Force more like 1.82 here as a favorite. So like I fully understand why the 4 was taken. And just kind of looking at the market, Todd, anytime San Diego State flashed to 4 yesterday, it got popped within minutes.
Oh, I mean, it's a massive key number. I mean, this takes on the field much more like an NFL game than it does a college football game with a total that low. Knowing the history between these two teams, it feels like every year it's decided by a field goal. And as you've talked about, neither one of these teams has the capabilities, at least as it appears on paper, to run away and hide, unless run away and hide is a 24-14 type victory. San Diego State, of course, trying to spark things as well. You uncovered the nugget that Lucas Johnson, who finished up the game against San Jose State 2 for 3 with 28 yards and 2 touchdowns coming in overtime, will get the nod at center. And Brady Hoke, to really shuffle things up, not only did Jordan Brookshire not just become the backup, he's 3rd string on the depth chart. So it tells you that the Aztecs want to go in a slightly different direction. Let's not kid ourselves. None of these quarterbacks are going to be first-round NFL draft caliber guys, but sometimes the spark, the body language, everything else that goes into it, as we've seen with Oklahoma, is a little bit more than what gets built into some of these numbers. And we'll see if the Aztecs can be slightly more balanced, aka only run it on 63% of their offensive snaps instead of running it on, basically north of 70.
Yep. I think this is a real interesting game from that perspective. Obviously, both teams are going to load the box and force the opponent to do what they don't like to do. But I just think San Diego State's shown to have enough beef up front where their power ground game has a chance to get going here. Just looking at this matchup.
One other thing, too, to keep in mind, and I don't think it's something that you want to quantify, but it is worth noting when you try and dissect this matchup. Air Force is very much in control of the Mountain Division. Even with a loss here against the team hailing from the Pacific side of things, they'll still be able to control their own destiny. Meanwhile, San Diego State appears to be stuck in a 3-horse race with arguably the 3 best teams in the entire league. Nevada and Fresno State, a game we'll get to in a few moments, both coming into this contest with San Diego State in a de facto round robin. So a loss here year against Air Force for the Aztecs would be a lot bigger in their quest to win the league than it would be for Air Force if they were to drop this decision, knowing that they have the tiebreaker at this point against Boise State. Non-conference game, Midwest in good old South Bend. It's the Notre Dame Fighting Irish welcoming in one of their traditional rivals, the USC Trojans. This game has been bet up to the Irish, a 7-point favorite at FanDuel Sportsbook. Total in the game, 57.5. 91st meeting between these proud programs. USC has won the last 4 in South Bend. Last year was the first time they didn't play since 2005. You look at USC, they've won 8 straight road games. And you try and identify where some of these things have gone. USC, all of their games this year have been decided by double digits, but in comes new head coach Dante Williams, extra time to prepare. Payne, I have to imagine Notre Dame has a massive coaching edge working in their favor with the experienced Brian Kelly against the interim head coach for USC.
I don't think it's even close. I seem to be a larger fan, and I think you are too, of Brian Kelly than some of the national narrative. And it's like, the guy really only loses to like the elite of elite programs. And he's kind of rebuilt this program in my mind and done it the right way. And obviously we know some of his restrictions on the recruiting realm compared to some of those elite teams that he's losing to. So I think there's a massive coaching mismatch here. There's really so many ways we could break this game down. There's so many moving parts and variance, as you kind of alluded to there, with USC basically playing in nothing but double-digit games. You have both teams coming off bye weeks, right? They could implement things that we haven't seen yet. In fact, I'd expect them to. You have Keaton Slovis playing for his job. Jack Cohen's playing for him. It does look like Tyler Buchner's practicing this week for Notre Dame. So I envision we see both quarterbacks, and I think that's probably the right approach and roll with the hot hand kind of scenario there. You saw Jack Cohn get benched after a shaky start against Virginia Tech, and then in comes Buchner, and suddenly Notre Dame's really anemic ground game got going. Kyron Williams found some room. If you look at some of Buchner's design runs against Va Tech, averaged a positive .32 EPA, but the problem was when it came time to throw, Buchner shit the bed. 2 picks, 1 return for a touchdown, 3 turnover-worthy throws, and 14 attempts. His adjusted accuracy was 57%, so in comes Jack Cohn again. And he takes the Irish on these back-to-back game-winning touchdown drives. I feel for Brian Kelly here. Like, does he go with Jack Cohn, who's the more accurate and refined passer, but takes bad sacks and has no pocket presence and can't run? Or do you go with Tyler Buchner, who lacks accuracy, but helps the ground game and is obviously your future? I think you need to keep USC on their heels. I think there's a reason.
Play them all, baby. Play them all.
I really think so. And it seems like if you go with Jack Cohn, there's going to be advantages through the air. USC's 127th in EPA per pass allowed. The Trojans have been absolutely shredded on standard down throws. And then when you look at the 6 offenses that USC's played, only Stanford barely ranks inside the top 50 in EPA per pass allowed. All 6 offenses have an average rank of 78th in EPA per pass. So really a bottom feeder schedule of passing offenses. I'm not saying Notre Dame is great in that area, but that's certainly where you want to attack USC's defense. At the same time, it makes sense to sprinkle in Tyler Buchner to the ground game. When you look at Notre Dame's run game and USC's run defense, this is bad on bad. And sometimes, Todd, as we kind of talked about off air a little bit, whichever team can kind of better mask that weakness, it ends up playing out to be a huge factor. Both Notre Dame's offensive line and USC's defensive line are hovering around 100th in line yards. Notre Dame's had 25% of their runs stopped at or behind the line of scrimmage. That's outside the top 100. USC's defensive line only stuffed 13% of runs. That's outside the top 100. So something has to give here. And I think if you kind of look at the week off, it probably favors the better, more well-coached team. And the problem with Notre Dame's offensive line isn't really the talent. They've recruited that area well. It's just very young. And so I think the bye week might actually help Notre Dame a little bit better there, with the offensive line. And then if you can get Tyler Buchner contributing with some of the designed run packages, especially in short yardage situations, I think that can help Notre Dame be a little bit more balanced on offense. And again, when it's Jack Cohn under center or it's Tyler Buckner, whoever it is, I think we need to see a little bit more from Tommy Rees. And I know that's a guy I've been a little bit critical of over the past few seasons, and I thought he did a better job during earlier portions of this year. But you look at that Va-Tech game, very predictable, right? Very, very predictable formations. And I think if he can kind of disguise things a little bit better, it's going to enhance the pass game and the ground game. But you look in that Va-Tech matchup, when Notre Dame lined up with a tight end on the field, they ran 88% of the time. When they lined up without a tight end on the field, they passed 75% of the time. Tommy Rees might as well just handed Virginia Tech his playbook. Now, maybe, Todd, you have the return of Michael Mayer here at tight end. His versatility can help Tommy Rees with some of those things, but we need to see a better effort here in game plan and script from Tommy Rees, and I think that'll open up this offense a little bit as well.
The one thing, there's a little level of optimism for Notre Dame. They think they've at least solidified the left side of their offensive line with Joe Alt and Andrew Christophic out there. We'll see if that pays dividends. I think you're spot on talking about having that extra time for a young offensive line to try and figure things out, take a step back, and finish the second portion of the season in the right mindset. I'll also make the case here, Payne, when you look at Notre Dame's schedule, USC will be the worst defense that they've faced, maybe all season long, depending on how you view your beloved Seminoles in Toledo weeks 1 and week 2, but Purdue, Wisconsin, Cincinnati, and even Virginia Tech to a lesser extent, all a lot more athletic, dynamic in terms of preventing big plays than what Notre Dame is going to encounter with a USC defense that has really shown a propensity for getting absolutely gashed both on explosive runs and explosive passes over the top.
Yeah, I mean, USC's defense over the years, we've had some question marks about, especially with some of the talent that they've brought in. It's just not meshing with what they're actually doing on the field. And so when the dust all settles here, and there's certainly a path to USC being a disaster in the back half of the season, I think this ultimately is going to dictate what they are the rest of the season. You could certainly make a case that with how Florida State's trending, and their defensive line's been actually pretty good this year for the Seminoles, you could make a case that USC might be the worst defense that Notre Dame has faced to date for sure, especially when the dust settles and you have an opportunity to look back at it at season's end.
We'll see how they're able to handle a little bit of prosperity as this number inches ever so close to going through the key number of 7. Of course, a night game in South Bend. Do want to correct myself when I introduced the game at the top. Notre Dame has actually won the last 4 games in South Bend, not USC. So an oversight on my behalf, as I want to try and stay as honest as possible and recognize the fact that I speak out of my ass half the time when we do this anyways. Nevada, Fresno State, Payne. For all the things we're not going to see in the San Diego State Air Force matchup in the Mountain West, hopefully we'll see on full display in the Central Valley, where Nevada brings in NFL draft hopeful Carson Strong, Jake Haener on the other side for Fresno State, dealing with a little bit of an ankle injury. The severity still very much up for debate in terms of how limited he's been. When, your head coach comes out and talks about Jake playing through pain tolerance, we know he was in a boot during the bye week, etc. The Wolfpack won the last meeting 37-26 in Reno. This looks to be, at least on the surface, an elimination game for Fresno, who already has a conference loss at Hawaii. A loss would put them to essentially 2.5 games behind Nevada. It will be the retirement of former Fresno State great Lorenzo Neal's jersey at halftime. And when you look at these two quarterbacks, Jake Haener leads the conference in passing yards per game, passing yards, yards per attempt, passing touchdowns, and efficiency rating. Carson Strong leads the conference in completion percentage, and he's behind Haener in passing yards per game, second with passing yards, second in touchdowns, and efficiency rating right behind. But the one area where Strong is significantly better is interception avoidance, where his percentages are that much lower. When you try and figure out this particular game, Payne, I think it's about how Fresno State's defense is able to contend with Carson Strong and his two talented difference makers as far as Romeo Doubs on the outside and the ongoing emergence of a talented tight end in Cole Turner, who comes into this game after a career-best 12 catches for 175 yards in Nevada's win against Hawaii last weekend.
You mentioned Lorenzo Neal's jersey getting retired. Have you reached out to Fortenbaugh to see if he'll be part of that ceremony?
I have not. I wonder if Joe, who did a lot of radio with him in the Bay Area, is on that short guest list to make the trip up to Fresno. We know it'll be a frenzied atmosphere, or maybe he'll have a chance to say a few words about his former radio co-host.
If he does, he'll be suited up. His suit game is increasing, very strong these days. The Fortenbaugh suit game. All right, on track here. I can't believe we're talking Nevada, Fresno State, but here we are.
I love it.
Here we are.
Your evolution as a West Coast football guy brings a tear to my eye every week we do this thing.
Yes. You mentioned Carson Strong. I think this could come back to bite me in the butt, but I must be missing something here. I've heard, obviously, people say he could be the number one pick in the draft. If Carson Strong's the first quarterback taken in the 2022 draft, this must be a really watered-down quarterback class.
Come on, your Dolphins. Your Dolphins are excited about Carson Strong as a top 3 pick as a potential replacement for Tua.
I was reading some of the things that he's had done to his knee, and that would just scare the hell out of me, anyone drafting him that early. I'll be candid. I don't watch every second of Mountain West football. I do try to catch some of the better teams and watch portions of each of those games. And then after I assess the teams on an Excel sheet, I kind of match it up. And I don't want my eyes to lie to me, but I want my data to kind of confirm what I see. And to me, this game is going to be squarely on the shoulders of Carson Strong. Nevada doesn't really want to run it, right? They're the 6th highest pass rate team in the country, but they also don't try to run because they're not very good at it. 103rd in rushing success rate, 85th in EPA per rush, and an offensive line that gets absolutely no push outside the top 100 in line yards. So this game is going to come down to Carson Strong being efficient on early downs. And that's immediately what caught my attention here is that little matchup, the game within the game here. And, every time I think you will listen to a breakdown of a game from talking heads on TV, ultimately third down gets mentioned. And that is always a down with variance. That is a very swingy down. There's not a lot of predictability to that down. And so what stood out to me is Nevada's 124th in the country in bypassing third down on first and second down, just inside the top 70 in early down EPA. So Nevada tends to live in third down situations. And so what I could see happen here is Carson Strong being forced to bail Nevada's offense out on third down through the air. And Fresno, through 6 weeks, has allowed 28% of passes to grade successful. They're 10th in EPA per pass allowed. So that could be the matchup here that kind of swings this. I am a little surprised, Todd, that money came in on Nevada. I know, as you alluded to, Jake Haener is dealing with the ankle issue. He's not 100%, but he's really credited the medical staff for their work. Fresno is the better early down team on both sides of the ball. Are you kind of feeling the same way I am in that the first move might not necessarily be the final move here?
That's generally my mindset. I mean, I looked at it. I thought 4.5 was a fair number, but the handicap is a little bit different as it gets down to 3. I actually like what I've seen from Fresno last weekend, notwithstanding against Wyoming. There was nasty wind gusts. I mean, we both read the same article and saw that Fresno was credited with 10 drops. I mean, Jalen Cropper, their top wide receiver, was all over the place, and they were still able to go out there with a workmanlike performance and clamp down defensively with their first road shutout as a program since 1974. The one area that I am slightly concerned about, you talk about Fresno and how good they've been with some of these defensive metrics. They haven't exactly faced a murderer's row when it comes to vertical passing games, and that was one thing when I looked at it. UConn, Oregon, Cal Poly, UCLA, UNLV, Hawaii, and Wyoming. So I do wonder if this is a jolt to the system for what Fresno's back 7 will be forced to encounter versus what they've dealt with through their first 3 Mountain West games of the season.
Oh, there's no doubt about it. The schedule plays a large role in some of Fresno's success defensively, especially through the air. The question becomes, and I watched some of the Nevada game last week, what did you make of that? It just felt like Carson Strong was also out there laboring with some of the knee issues. He certainly wasn't accurate at times. And again, this probably comes back to bite me in the butt, but I didn't see the quarterback that I had constantly heard about. And I know it's a 1-game sample size, and don't take too much from that. But I wasn't overly impressed with Carson Strong.
The one thing that I will take away from that game, and unfortunately I watched it from start to finish, having a bet on the over, realizing that thing was dead and buried when Hawaii couldn't throw a forward pass midway through the third quarter, that I found interesting, and I think the game was on CBS Sports Network, and I don't remember who the announcing team was, but the one criticism they had of Carson Strong wasn't even in what he was doing from a mechanical standpoint, whether it was zip getting the ball down the field or going through his progressions, but his demonstrative behavior when it came to receivers dropping passes or not getting the protections. And you wonder if that's something that can get significantly better with maturity. But I can tell you one thing, whether it's a first string or second or third string offensive line in the National Football League, if your quarterback is constantly pointing the finger at you being the reason he's not able to go out there and excel, not going to endear yourself to those big uglies in front the same way a Derrick Henry does for buying jewelry for every member of the big uglies paving the path for record-setting rushing performance.
Every single error by his teammates, that's costing him money in the draft. That's the thought process there, I'm sure.
I mean, it's definitely a big part. And trust me, having been in a position, not as a quarterback where you feel like you're on an island and you're always under a microscope, not because I was ever going to play at the next level by any stretch of the imagination, but if things around you start to break down, you have to try and be the eraser. There were a couple of drop touchdown passes from Lockhart. I think was one on a slant that would have gone the distance. Even Romeo Doubs wide open in the end zone getting behind the Hawaii secondary. So you wonder if Nevada will be a little bit sharper and crisper in that department. And I think that probably explains why you have seen a little bit of over money for a total that opened as low as 60.5.
Yeah, I would expect that we get the best version of Carson Strong here in a game of this magnitude, as you alluded to. Tough sledding, a potential elimination game of sorts in the conference, and Fresno's defense probably hasn't been tested against a quarterback of this level. It's just interesting for me. My gut says that we are probably going to see something on Fresno come in at some point. But if I had my choice, and again, and this will bite me in the butt, I kind of want to go with Jake Haener over Carson Strong. I know the upside isn't quite there, and he's got to build more like Drew Brees than your traditional pocket quarterback. But just from what I have seen, Jake Haener's been more impressive to me.
Man, am I curious to see when these draft boards come out.
I'm not saying he's getting drafted ahead of him because I think the size and stature will play a role. But just from what I've seen as a college
in general.
Yeah. Oh, if Carson Strong's the first quarterback taken, it'll be interesting to see.
Well, I can tell you Sam Howell's stock hasn't exactly been climbing through the roof with what he's done in North Carolina this season either. So may not be the deepest of classes when it comes to trying to identify a franchise quarterback, which will put a few teams in a bit of a delicate position as they try and identify what the face will look like when they get to the next level.
The hope is Matt Corral might have a chance in the first round unless, Lane Kiffin turns him into Jerome Bettis the rest of the season.
He starts carrying the ball 30 times every game going forward for Ole Miss and helps them finish their SEC schedule with one loss. I'm not sure he's going to be able to carry himself to the draft out here in Las Vegas next April.
He's not big on sliding.
No, that he is not. For all the work he's put in, he wants to drop that shoulder and make the defender feel his wrath. But a very impressive performance from Ole Miss, at least on the offensive side last week in their win against the Tennessee Volunteers. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. You, of course, can follow me there. Most importantly, follow the podcast at BetTheBoardPod. FanDuel.com/BetTheBoard. $1,000 free bets, enhanced odds, everything that you could possibly want at your disposal as a sports bettor. And like I said at the top of the show, we want to welcome all of our friends in the Nutmeg State into the FanDuel family with legalized sports betting being unveiled for you earlier this week. Payne, as is the tradition and custom around these parts, there is one final thing that we have to do before we bid our listeners a fond farewell for college football week 8, and that's identifying an investable opportunity in this week's college football market.
The Nutmeg State threw me way off. That's really interesting.
All sorts of things that I can teach you from my time out on the East Coast.
Absolutely. Connecticut, the Nutmeg State. Interesting. This is going to be, right, like, what a big game here. And you look at this card and just lots of great games, and we're going to probably the best game of the entire Saturday board for our best bet, Todd. Are you ready?
Oh, 100% we are. We're going to Arkansas, Pine Bluff, Arkansas, right? That's where we're going to?
No.
Oh.
We're going to go...
LIU, Central Connecticut?
No. Now you're confusing people. Rotation number 359. Let's go with the Temple Owls here. If I look at our power ratings incorporating every single game Temple's played, we don't get to a point of value, right? We make it South Florida minus like 1.2, not enough to invest. But if I only incorporate games and snaps and plays in which DeJuan Mathis has played, Temple then shifts to a favorite in this spot. And it feels like they're just playing better ball right now. I look, and it's minimal, but they do have the advantage on each side of the ball. Their pass defense is far and away the best unit in this game. So I think it makes a lot of sense with Temple coming off the bye, especially with a coach in Rod Carey, which we like. And he outlined coming into the season that they had gotten off to a slow start in camp. There were some issues there, and I think they're starting to round into form a little bit, can get above 500 in this game, and I think Rod Carey's the substantially better coach, and he's going to make use of that bye. And so I think Temple wins this game outright. It makes sense for us to take the points here, Todd. And I think just kind of looking at the market, 3 minus 20 is more than suitable to give out here on the Temple Owls.
Yep, I think that's a fair assessment. I know there are plenty of 2.5s painted out there as well. I'm of the same mindset as you. When you look at some of these low numbers in college football, yes, it's not 100% success rate, but you're talking about teams in that 1 to 3 range. If you're going to cover, you're oftentimes going to win it outright. So, but may as well take the insurance there at +3 minus $1.20. I don't think we'll need the points. And in DeJuan Mathis, we trust to take advantage of a USF team that had their hearts broken last weekend in a 1-point loss against Tulsa in a game where the stat sheet was relatively ugly and suggested that USF was pretty fortunate to even be in that football game from start to finish.
That was one of the sharper sides of the week. USF +8.5, closed like 7.2 some places, and I didn't watch it. I just kind of saw the score updates on the Don Best screen, and they looked like they were entrenched in that game. And then I went back and watched, and it was like outgained by over 300 yards. And so that was a very misleading final score for South Florida. I actually had to downgrade them a tick, as crazy as that sounds, for a side that got steamed and then covered the spread, but they were dominated. And so, again, with DeJuan Mathis only incorporating snaps in which he's taken, there's a lot of value here, and I think the buy for Rod Carey and this team really is going to help substantially here. So Temple plus the points, we think they win outright.
Nothing like a lovely fall Saturday where you tell your friends and family that you have appointment viewing at 7 o'clock Eastern Saturday night to tune in on ESPN Plus and watch the Temple Owls roll into Tampa and take care of the Bulls. You can follow Payne on Twitter at Payne Insider. I'm Todd Furman. Follow me there. Podcast at Bet the Board Pod. Best of luck with all of your college football Week 8 investments. We'll be back with you on Thursday previewing the National Football League Week 7 slate. And in the interim, wherever your investments take you, hopefully we'll see you at the window.